All right, so it's 8 o'clock. Welcome, everyone. This is the December edition of the BètaBreak of this month, and this is in collaboration with Spy25. My name is Zoe, and I will be moderating together with Saad today. We have two speakers who will introduce themselves shortly. First of all, I want to tell you that we also have Crystal off screen who will be monitoring the questions for us. If you have any questions, feel free to send them. Crystal will select some and we will answer a few of the questions at the end of each section, after which we will end most of the questions at the end of the talk, because this is when we have most time to do so. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the BètaBreak, we are a student-initiated science discussion platform of the Faculty of Science, which is also why this talk will be in English, as we have a lot of international students there. Usually we host on a very broad range of subjects within the exact and natural sciences, but today's subject is a little bit different, as we will talk more so about the communication side of science. Now, communication is very important in times of COVID-19, of course, and what we have seen is that there are quite a few conspiracy theories that are showing up in this day and age. Now, in these times, this can, of course, affect the public health, which is a very relevant question. So it seems like a very apt time to evaluate the way that these theories evolve and what we as individual scientists, as well as the scientific community, can do to prevent these theories from developing, as well as to mitigate any possible negative effects. So what we will do is we will divide this talk into three sections. Firstly, we will introduce the problem itself, and we will follow this by the current handling of the situation and what our role as scientists is in this issue. Finally, we will move on to possible solutions to give this a constructive ending. Now, for this discussion, we have two speakers with us today. So thank you very much for being here, both of you. Maybe first, Professor Danielle Timmermans, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Zoe. My name is Danielle Timmermans. I am professor in public health risk communication at the Amsterdam UMC, the VU University. My teaching and my research focuses on how people perceive the health risks and make decisions about these health risks. And it focuses also, for instance, on infectious diseases, vaccination, but also electromagnetic fields like 5G, 3G, etc. And also how to communicate this information to foster informed decision making. And until 1.5 years ago, I was also Chief Science Officer at the risk communication at the RIVM, the National Institute for Public Health and the Environment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And we have Dr. Bastiaan Rutjes with us as well. Could you introduce yourself as well?
Yes, hi, I'm Bastiaan. I am a social psychologist working at the University of Amsterdam as an assistant professor. My research has been focusing in the last couple of years mainly on the psychology of science. So what are some of the reasons for why some people have a higher distrust in science than other people? What are some of the causes and consequences of skepticism about, for example, climate change, climate science, vaccination, genetic modification, or evolution? And yeah, my lab is really sort of focusing on trying to gain more insight into science trust, science distrust, and maybe in the future also how to prevent such science distrust.
All right, great, thank you. So I think that we can start with the first section right now, and that is the actual problem. So what are we talking about today? And so in relation to COVID-19, we see, and to vaccination in general, we see quite a few theories pop up frequently. So many of you have probably heard about theories involving the 5G radiation in relation to COVID-19. There's theories about Bill Gates being involved negatively in vaccines, for example, and people even claim that COVID-19 as a whole is a hoax. So what we do not want to do today is get into too much detail about all the theories there are, because there are so many, and some of them may be relevant, some of them may be less relevant, but we really want to talk about how these theories evolve, where there is a point for concern, and also how to distinguish conspiracy theories from actual skepticism and critical thinking. Now, I guess we can start with how these conspiracy theories actually come about. So, Bastiaan, could you maybe tell us a little bit about why people start adhering to these theories?
Yeah, I think it's already a very good question. So I think conspiracy theories are not primarily caused by certain, say, individual difference variables or personality characteristics. They're really more sort of situationally induced. So if you have a certain situation in which you find yourself, which is, for example, very uncertain, it feels that you don't really have control of the situation, and you really cannot predict what will happen in the near future regarding that situation. That's, psychologically speaking, really what very sort of fertile ground for conspiracy theories to evolve and spread. So with COVID, I think COVID is a perfect example of this. So you have a pandemic, which basically consists of a unknown disease. We've been learning quite a lot about COVID, but if you think back about how little we knew only half a year ago about COVID-19, it's quite astonishing what we've learned in the last 6 months. But especially in the beginning, when there was so much uncertainty, you can imagine that people will are looking for ways to make sense of a very unpredictable and uncontrollable and uncertain situation. And what a conspiracy theory generally does is provide an easy answer. For example, by giving an explanation for why the virus exists in the first place. You know, it's been deliberately caused by some government, or it's been deliberately produced in a laboratory, etc., etc. And these types of monocausal explanations are really quite psychologically appealing when the need for such control and certainty is that high. Of course, reality is more complex. There's a lot of randomness involved in reality and how such a virus comes about. But that's not really appealing from a psychological perspective. So people are looking for a way to make sense of the situation. Also, I guess, to add to that, to try to predict the future in terms of COVID. So if COVID is really caused by Bill Gates, for example, then you could say, well, then we can fix the problem. We have to look at Bill Gates. When it's caused by all these random factors interacting in all kinds of unpredictable ways, then it's really hard to think about ways to prevent this problem in the future. And that's not appealing at all, of course.
Okay, thank you. So in relation to what we actually, so this is a high risk situation, I guess you could say. COVID-19 is a real problem that we are experiencing. The common theories, maybe Daniela, you could tell us a little bit about this. How realistic are the risks related to these theories?
How realistic are these stories? Well, depends how you look at it, of course. I agree with Bastiaan, a lack of control and predictiveness, that's one of the things which fosters conspiracy theories. But I also think that people who have conspiracy theories have a high level of distrust towards authorities, governments, and also a high level of concerns. And these also are very important for these conspiracy theories. And when you look at it in this way, people's concerns are real, but the way they express it might be not very realistic. But in that sense, there's a truth in it. But also, give, for instance, Bill Gates and the nanochips in the vaccines. That is actually an old story. It was 11 years ago also with the vaccines from the Mexican flu. Beginning of when the social media became very big, of course. So it's a strong story in that sense. People are always suspicious about vaccines, and this is an expression of it. And related to Bill Gates, maybe there's an uneasiness regarding Bill Gates, because how can one person have so much money and sponsor a lot of public health initiatives that he has an impact on public health? this is not a one citizen's case. It is up to the government to do something about it. So it's not democratic what Bill Gates is doing. So maybe it's this my idea, the expression of the uneasiness that one person has so much money, he has an impact on public health. So when you look at the concerns and the criticism behind the stories, then these are realistic. Yeah. And to make it even more complicated, when you look at some, well, the nanochips, okay, I think that's not true. But anyway, when you look at other stories like the theories around the anti-vaccination from the regular program, the problem there is that it's not completely wrong. There is some truth in it. So what they say, it's correct. For instance, when they say the decline in infectious diseases became far before the vaccination program was introduced, and that's true. So it's the mix from true facts, so to speak, and things which are not true, which makes it difficult to refute also. And maybe that's also one of the appealing characteristics of conspiracy theories. Yes, there is some truth in it.
Yes, and is that maybe also part of why they are so easy to proliferate, and also why that's part of where the kind of danger lies, because they are so easily spread because of this source of truth in them? I don't know if maybe you can discuss about that a little bit. I don't know how Bastian feels about this as well.
Oh,
yeah, I agree with Daniela. Of course, depending on the theory, there will be some truth to well, at least part a portion of conspiracy theories, and it's true about infectious diseases. You know, with you know, increase in public health standards, etc., that they gradually started to decrease. But I think the vaccination program really sort of added to that as well, right? So. And, you know, some conspiracy theories, for example, pertaining to vaccination, childhood vaccination, like vaccinations leading to autism, these, I mean, this has been debunked already quite a while ago. There's so much research now showing that there's no link whatsoever, no causal link whatsoever between vaccination and autism, that we can safely assume, we can be very, well, let's not say 100% certain, but almost certain, approaching certainty that this is not the case. But still, of course, many people have concerns about the safety of their children when they think about vaccinating their children. And of course, it makes sense, because vaccination is an act of prevention. Your child isn't sick, there's nothing wrong with your child, and still you need to vaccinate. And this feels psychologically, I guess, a little bit strange and risky as well. Why would I risk potential side effects, for example, when my child is perfectly fine? And this is like going to the dentist, right? You're not going when you have a problem, you're going to prevent problems. So it makes sense to have concerns about vaccination and side effects of vaccination, but there's a difference. I think there's a difference between legitimate concerns on the one hand, and sort of full-blown conspiracy theories, which by and large have been debunked. And that's the difference. I think we have to take concerns very seriously, but we also have to sort of draw a line where things are obviously not true.
Yes. So, Daniela, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Bastian is very right. You have to make a distinction between the very small group who has really strong conspiracy theories and a much larger group who have a lot of concerns and a lot of questions regarding vaccination, and now with the corona vaccination and new vaccinations too. So when there's only 40% agree that they're going to get the vaccine, and the rest has questions, oh, that's normal. It's a new vaccine, a new situation. So if people are not, I'm for it and certain about getting the vaccine, that's not a strange situation. They have questions, concerns, and you have to address these questions and concerns. And on the other hand, side effects do occur with vaccines. A lot of side effects, to mild ones, but in the history there have been situations where are rather strong side effects. So it happens. There is a risk of it. So that's true. Very small, but anyway, there is a risk.
Yeah, that's interesting, Danielle. The risk aspect, I think, of course, life cannot be totally risk-free. No. It's like when you take a child for a drive in the back of your car, you also take a modest risk, I suppose. Sure. And maybe you should view vaccinations in the same way, right? So there's a small chance of something happening, usually mild side effect, if any side effect, but it's a risk you take, I guess, in light of, I guess, the greater public good to prevent diseases to spread, which of course in turn, if you look at measles, once you contract measles, the risk of getting into a really bad situation is far more severe, of course.
Yeah, well, and the problem is that you have to give this example from when you take your child in to drive to go to grandma or whatever. Mm-hmm. You also take a risk, but there's benefit in it because you go to grandma. That's very nice. But when you give your child a vaccination, there's no benefit at all.
Not a visible benefit.
No, you said it right. You do it for the common good, and usually also childhood vaccination. You vaccinate in general for the vulnerable people, the other ones, and until 76 or whatever it was, there was no vaccination against measles, and people older than 45 or something like that, like myself, we all had the measles, no problem. Only if you're weak, then there's a problem with measles. And that's why they introduced the vaccine. And now your child has a small risk of side effects. You think autism, you've heard something about autism. And then you think, oh, well, no, not for me, because what's the benefit for my child? So that's also behind it.
So it's a public goods dilemma in a sense.
Yeah, public goods dilemma, yes. Yeah. And what is also true, and I think that it would be wise to make explicit what the risks are and what the benefits are, for whom are the benefits. In general, I think in the information for parents, it's not very clear. So I think it would be wise to make explicit what the risks are, and also with this new vaccine, make it explicit. And a lot of experts think that when you make these risks explicit, then people are getting scared. But the opposite is true. Making those risks explicit make people lowers the risk perception. And I think that's related because people think there are risks. And if you say, no, there are no risks, and then you think, oh, they're withholding something. And when you're explicit and you're transparent, okay, they know what they're talking about. I'll trust that person. That's the mechanism. That's, I think.
So it's really about a lot of transparency as well. And I know we're going to move on a little bit from this because we're getting back to this later on in the conversation as well. But something that both of you already touched upon a little bit, which is still really relevant for the first section, is that you really distinguish two different groups. So you have that group of people who are in doubt or critical, and you have the group that are real conspiracy theorists. What would you say is the exact thing that distinguishes one group from the other? Because there is apparently some sort of line there. Is there any way you could summarize that? It's a question for both of you.
Yeah, distrust in authorities, strong distrust. That's what I think.
Yeah, distrust, I think plays a substantial role. I agree. So the difference between legitimate concerns and well, I guess not every anti-vaxxer, for example, is a conspiracy theorist, right? So there's also a distinction there. You might have people who are very strongly anti-vaccination for a particular reason or a particular set of reasons, but they might not be inclined to believe in any conspiracy theories pertaining to vaccination or maybe other stuff like climate change, right? So it depends. Of course, there's overlap, but it's not necessarily the case, I think. I think distrust in science and experts and authorities plays a role, as Daniela mentioned, but there's also some individual difference variables that we find in our research that seem to play a role. So traditionally, if you look at vaccination, anti-vaxxers, if you will, traditionally you find these on the Bible Belt, right? So there's a religious, there's a subset of religious believers, religious Orthodox people who have because of their faith, an enormous problem with vaccination. It just doesn't, it clashes with their religious beliefs. But more recently, in the 21st century, we've been seeing, besides Bible Belt skepticism, more sort of modern, urban, if you will, vaccination skeptics, and also really diehard anti-vaxxers. And this group of people is different. And what we find, one of the sort of individual difference variables that seems to be correlated with that is spirituality. So sort of modern spiritual, sort of new age type of beliefs seem to correlate quite strongly with vaccination skepticism. One reason could be that these people view vaccines as something which is not natural. It's not part of a natural lifestyle. But it could also be that there are other issues. For example, that if you look at many spiritual beliefs, seem to focus on the idea that what is real, what is true, is something that must be felt. Comes from the inside. So there's this clash with accepting truth from an outside authority, an expert, or maybe even a religious leader, and truth coming from within, sort of what you feel is right. And if vaccines don't feel right, which of course makes sense because it's quite counterintuitive, to vaccinate, to think about vaccination. It's a counterintuitive idea. Then you can imagine that for some people with certain, spiritual beliefs, for example, have more of an issue. So you're seeing, besides distrust in authorities, you're seeing that certain segments of the population seem to be more prone also to anti-vaccination attitudes.
Yeah, maybe it's also different between different conspiracy theories. Maybe I think it's not, if you have a conspiracy theory about that COVID-19 is a hoax, it's not necessarily the case that you think the climate change is not caused by humans.
Exactly.
So it's
Sorry, Danielle. Yeah, no, thank you for bringing it up. That's very interesting, and it is indeed quite a lot of research now shows that there's a lot of what we call heterogeneity between different forms of science skepticism. So climate change skepticism is really something which we find among political, say right-wing political ideologies. Spirituality or religious belief don't really have anything to do with it. It seems, according to the data at least. Whereas for vaccination, it's not really political at all. And things again look different for genetic modification or evolution. So it really depends on the domain of science, as Danielle pointed out.
Yeah, maybe it's also then related to people's values. You were saying how people think what's true and what they use, what kind of reasoning they use to decide what is true, what's not true. And I think that values plays a role in it. And if you value naturalness and earthness, whatever how you call it, if you value that very highly, then you more likely to think that vaccination is not a good idea.
Right. Exactly.
Yes. Internal aspect to it. And I'm intervening right now because I actually have a question from the audience which somewhat relates to this internal. It's a question by Ava, and she says, I was wondering, what would you say is the difference between another opinion and a conspiracy or even delusions in psychosis? So we've been a little bit about this another opinion versus conspiracy, but like factoring in the idea of delusion, how would you say that relates to conspiracy theories?
Well, that's a good question. I think that many conspiracy theory adherents aren't necessarily delusional. I guess it depends again on the theory. I think it's really quite a natural reaction to very extreme events. We shouldn't downplay the severity of the situation we're in and the psychological distress that it causes. Again, related to the uncertainty and unpredictability that we talked about earlier. So I really think it's quite a sort of natural way of responding to such a global situation. But of course, once conspiracy theories get more extreme, thinking, for example, about QAnon, if I pronounce that correctly, or like cannibalistic, like baby-eating elites. I mean, I can imagine that that's something which doesn't really appeal to, say, the regular person that you would bump into in the street. This might be something more for the less, well, maybe bordering a little bit on the clinical, but the clinical psychologist.
There are some similarities with psychosis, of course, because in a psychosis, people want to have a coherent. I don't know what happens because there is a coherent. So I go on. Okay.
Yeah, you can go.
Okay. The similarity with the psychosis that people want to have a coherent story and they're very suspicious about everything, so it's distrust. But of course, this is a clinical situation, and the origin, the causes are different, of course. So, but I agree with Bastian. There's something very natural, very logical about it, and that is also relates also to people having a psychosis. But that's also that's clinical, that's different. Yeah. Okay, start again.
We're still live, so everything's okay.
Yeah, everything's ordered and all.
Yeah, I think that this more or less rounds off the first section of the talk. So maybe we can move on to the second one.
Yeah, I'll take it over here. So part 2. So we want to talk a bit more about our roles. We tend to see that science is portrayed within political discussions and greater societies as almost monolithic institution, like always in agreement and at all times with all issues. But this is, of course, for a lack of a better term, bogus. As virtually all fields of science, there are internal disagreements on conduct and ideas, and there are biases and interests to keep track of. So with science, disagreements aren't handled like one would handle a discussion in the pub or a political debate, making them difficult for people outside the field to really understand. What's a difficulty in communication, leading to less trust in scientists and unsound conclusions on what the science says about a hot topic issue, as you've mentioned, climate change. We'd like to talk in this section how individual scientists and scientific institutions can improve their communication to reduce these types of misunderstandings that could lead to conspiratorial thinking. So for the both of you, how do we best communicate this kind of like a nuance that you learn over the years to a lay public that probably doesn't want to give you like more than 30 minutes to explain a topic because they have to go to work?
Yeah. Do I understand you correctly that that you say that scientists have to communicate the difference between when experts disagree and when there is difference between interpretation of facts or so? I think that experts disagree always, which is maybe. Yeah, well, that's the way it is, and especially when there's a contested issue. There have been several in recent years, not only Corona, but maybe you remember 3 years ago, rubber crumb on sports fields, quite a different health risk. There's hardly any, but because it also involved cancer and also involved kids, then that was a big issue. And then when a lot of experts in the Netherlands say, well, there's not a big issue and it's not very dangerous, and people don't believe that, and they go to and the media go to even Belgium or so to find an expert who has a different opinion. And that, well, in that case we had one in the Netherlands with a different opinion, but so you can't expect scientists to agree with each other in the media. That will not happen. So you expect disagreement, but I don't know if that's a problem.
No, that's. I mean, I guess that's the strength of science, isn't it? Some have defined science as organized skepticism. So scientists, usually, I mean, if science works well, then the idea of science is that you're not trying to prove your own theory to be right, but you're trying to disprove that the other is right? So it's always about testing what is the current status quo in a certain field. And I think that's what separates science from other cultural institutions, if you, for lack of a better term, I guess. So science is always in flux, and the best that science can offer, I think, is not certainty, but a certain amount of something verging maybe on certainty, like extreme likelihood that something is true, but we never can be 100% sure, certain. And I'm not a communication expert, but I can imagine that there's a role for education here. Maybe starting in secondary school already, sort of, explaining to children in schools what science is supposed to do, and also what it isn't supposed to do, and maybe philosophy of science or something like that, right? So just an introduction to what science is, I think that would help. Sometimes it seems to be the case that a certain segment, at least of the general public, is not really aware of that inherent uncertainty of science. And if you're not aware of that, then it's not surprising that if you see scientists quibble in the media about these rubber grain, what was it?
Rubber crumbs.
Yeah, exactly, rubber crumbs in the sports field, but also COVID, that people say, see, they're not even in agreement. So why should I trust them? So I think there's maybe more so than public communication, there's a role for education, for people to learn a little bit more about how science is more about uncertainty than about certainty in the end.
Yeah, and added to that, I think also that scientists can better could use the language people are used to, because I know that many toxicologists complain that people don't understand that the dose makes the poison, and that's quite a jargon, and a lot of scientists think, oh, people don't understand. But when you explain it in the terms and the words people use themselves, they can very well understand. We did a study about the risk of chemical additives in food, and when you explain it in their words, that the more often you use it and the longer you are exposed, then it adds to the risk, to the health risk, and then people do understand. So when you talk about your field, your expert field, many scientists, we also are inclined to use our own jargon and our own the words we use to our colleagues. Don't do that. Use the words normal people use. It seems easy, but it's not that in the case. When you see the communication about COVID-19, Corona, why are we talking about R? R should be below 1. That's silly, isn't it? Explain it in normal terms. Maybe more people will understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely do think it's interesting to see how that works with scientific jargon, especially because I'm doing the physics study, so I've kind of become way too used to a lot of rather awful amounts of it. So there's like a particular distinction that I'm thinking about. I think that Daniela has a good idea of how this works. Is there like any distinction you could really point out to determine whether the risk perceived within, let's say, some kind of issue like corona vaccines in this stage can be considered correct or incorrect? Or do we have to like treat all questions similar?
Is there such a thing as an objective for correct risk? Well, of course, my answer is no, there isn't. It's all perceived risk. Experts have a different perception or different beliefs about the risk than citizens has. And when you see how now related to Corona, the risk perception differs, of course, between how old you are. Young people don't see a high risk, which is true, of course. For citizens, other aspects are also important for appreciating a risk, like a fair distribution of the benefits and harms. And if there's no benefit to a risk, then your risk perception is higher. Or when it comes from outside, it's not controllable and is imposed. All these aspects makes that people perceive a risk as higher. And these aspects do not play a role for experts in general because they think about the probability of harm. So different aspects are related to the perception of risk for the experts and for citizens. And I have to emphasize also, an expert is also a citizen outside his or her field of expertise, and he acts the same. So this makes it different to talk about the correct risk. And if experts think, well, we have the objective risk and the citizens have the subjective risk, no, I don't agree with that. Because they think they own the concept of risk. They don't. It's a concept from all the people, so to speak.
All right. Yeah, so in a sense, risk, we do have to take the perceived risk of other people seriously, and we can't just make some kind of objective line on that. And something that I do wonder about is that there is like a level of trust within that. And of course, when there is trust, there is a certain expectation of scientists and like how moral they are. And that is the part where I want to ask Bastiaan about, because we probably also need to eventually get on the idea of how people perceive scientists to begin with when it comes to, trusting them with these risk assessments.
Yeah, no, there's quite a lot of interesting research on the perceived morality of scientists, and it's quite interesting if you look at the cultural archetype of the scientist. You often have this male, mad, evil, dangerous scientist, like Frankenstein or Dr. Caligari, Faust, these types of cultural archetypes. But if you look at experimental research now, you still see that the stereotypes about scientists still are a little bit in line with that. So scientists are stereotyped as very competent, but not very moral. Doesn't necessarily mean that people think that scientists are immoral, but it's more the case that scientists are often perceived as not that interested in morality. So maybe amoral, more so than immoral. Right? So what it means is that people sometimes think about scientists as putting morality or certain ethics below the need to gain knowledge. So in many situations, people think that scientists will let knowledge gain prevail over ethical concerns. Something you see, for example, with stem cell research or gene editing, these types of topics. And these stereotypes are quite widespread. You find these across different cultures, countries, etc. And they partially have to do, I think, with the idea that people really don't know much about science or scientists, many people at least. So there's quite a strong, what you could call social distance to if you ask people, that there are large-scale surveys conducted by these really big survey companies asking people across the globe, do you know a scientist? More than 50% of people across the world say no. So when people don't know an actual scientist, it's quite understandable that they might come up with a stereotypical way of thinking about what a scientist is and what a scientist does. And what we found in recent research that relates to that is the idea that if you ask people about scientists in general, they seem to think more about industry-related scientists or industry-affiliated scientists. So people working for pharmaceutical industry companies, for example. And people have quite negative associations and stereotypes about scientists working for these types of companies. Whereas if you explicitly tell people, well, this is a certain scientist, but he or she works at a university in academia, these stereotypes become much less negative. And you're seeing that these people are perceived as more moral and equally competent. So it really depends also on the way that we frame, if you will, a scientist to the public. So if you add some more information about what a scientist does and where he or she works, that already helps to counter at least some of these stereotypical associations that people have of scientists, for example, being not so interested in morality.
And there is also truth in it, the distrusting scientists who work for the pharmaceutical industry. I would say. Well,
maybe, but it would be interesting to do research on scientists' own, views on what is ethical and moral, etc., and sort of pit that against the common stereotypes about scientists and see what happens. I'm not aware of that research being done yet, so that might be something interesting to do in future work.
But that's interesting. But when you relate it to scientists working in the medicine and health, in public health, for a large part they are doctors, medical doctors, and doctors are one of the most trusted occupation we have. And that's because of the reason, because you think they have the same values. They are there for you, to take care of you. So that's the reason why you trust them.
Yeah, that's very true, and it would be good to add to that we're talking a lot about distrust in science and scientists, etc. But it's important to mention, I think, that generally, across the population, this goes for the Netherlands, but many other countries as well, trust in science is high. Trust in science and scientists is up there with trust in medical doctors, in occupations like firefighters. There's a lot of respect, for these types of occupations, and that also goes for scientists. Where things go wrong is when people start thinking about a certain domain of science, like vaccination or climate science or maybe genetic modification. In fact, that's when people start to become worried or concerned, and we're starting to see this skepticism. But generally, I think that's really important to stress is that public trust in science is very high, and especially the case in the Netherlands.
Yeah, that's true. And the skepticism for science is particularly there in contested issues.
Exactly.
We already talked about it: climate change, vaccination, maybe fracking, or mobile 5G, electromagnetic fields, because a lot of interest, economic interest involved, and that's one of the aspects why it's also contested. So I agree that in general the trust in science is quite high, and I think higher than 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, that's. I think there's some surveys showing indeed that that's the case. And of course, about skepticism in science, you never hear about people being skeptical about, I don't know, a branch of physics. Maybe when you look at flat earthers, that's a different story. But generally, that's there's a lot of domains of science where you hardly ever hear about skepticism.
Yeah, it's only certain fields.
So now that you are talking about stuff that's really far off the end, like flat Earth, I'm also thinking, and this is a question for Daniela, since she's worked in the correct types of institutions for this question. How do scientific institutions and also governments react to really out their views in practice?
Sorry, how do they react
to out their views, like just general weird ideas?
Well, what I want to do, like the Public Health Institute and RIVM, when they hear about myths or untruths about vaccination, they want to correct it and they want to replace it with the correct information. That's what I do in general. I would say they approach it from a very from a literal point of view, they think, well, this is incorrect information, so we communicate the correct information, and then people say, oh well, okay, now I know what is the truth and what is correct, and now I change my mind. That's the way they approach it, and there has been some studies that might be counterproductive. That instead of debunking the myths, instead of having people change their mind, especially when there are high levels of concern, people even are more against, for instance, vaccination, because they don't address the concerns behind these incorrect beliefs, so to speak. So I think the reaction of these kind of institutes could be more psychological. I think that would be better. Yeah.
That's I totally agree. If I can add to what Daniela was saying, there's some work now showing also that this idea of what has been called the information deficit model. So there's just a lack of knowledge and understanding. That's sort of outdated. It's you can't just throw more information at people and expect them to then suddenly comply and believe in the science. It's about taking concerns seriously. I think that's the first point, as Daniela was saying, and also to try to address the concerns in a way that you speak the language of the concern indeed. So if you think about, for example, concerns about vaccination being not natural, then it would be good to try to enter a dialogue with a person and maybe try to shine a light on the fact that actually vaccination is a way of helping nature, the immune system, for example, to battle a disease, right? It's just maybe a silly example, but that could be a way to address this concern about unnaturalness without just saying, use some more data. Now, please trust that vaccination.
Trust us. Don't help.
That's not working. A colleague in Australia, Matthew Hornsey, talks about what he calls the jiu-jitsu approach, like the martial art, which is don't try to overpower your opponent with your strength, but try to roll along, with your opponent. So instead of trying to fight your opponent by trying to, put him down or her down, try to roll along with the arguments and come up with a way to engage in a meaningful dialogue, and remove the concerns that the person might have. That's probably a more fruitful.
But that's a good approach in a one-to-one conversation. But when all the myths are on social media, that would be a little bit more complicated.
Yeah,
I think. But still, you have to find a way to do that. Just saying it's not true something and give more data, that's for sure, that will not help. Yeah.
No, I'm picturing this massive jiu-jitsu competition with thousands and thousands of people. That's not going to fly, I'm sure.
Yeah. For the sake of Basin, I found this rather excellent question with which we can go to the next part. What are a good set of questions to ask ourselves and others when we are presented with a conspiracy theory? Because now we're just talking about institutions, but we're being watched by STEM students, so we want to know how we should react.
Are you as a student would react when there are conspiracy theories in your among your friends or family or whatever?
Interpersonal, so like now that we're students, but also when we in the future have to work within scientific institutions.
Yeah, well, I think you must ask yourself, why are these people having conspiracy theories? If you determine if it's a conspiracy theory, because it's not always clear, is it a conspiracy of just an opinion? But the first thing you have to ask yourself, why has this person a conspiracy theory? What are they concerned about? Because it reflects some concerns, I think, and that's the topic you have to discuss with that person. Why are they afraid of their concerns, and give answer to these, address these concerns. And maybe also what might help. you can think, what if it's true what he or she is thinking? And then, and from that point of view, look at the world or the information, and maybe you can understand better why this person is thinking in that way.
Right, and maybe also, I think one good way to start also is to see, are the concerns expressed by this person about the policies, the political decisions that are made based on scientific data, right? So maybe the concerns are about the way that the Dutch government is creating all kinds of regulations and restrictions, etc. Or are the concerns more about the data themselves? The actual data on which the policies are based. I think that's an important distinction to make. I mean, I think it's quite valid to have concerns about political decisions and policy decisions based on data. I think it's something else when people have doubts about the data. These decisions are based on themselves, and then you enter into a different type of discussion. I think so. You maybe have to be a bit more mindful.
But even then, you can be also critical on the data, of course, because data are not very hard, and and especially not when it's in contested issues, because scientists also select facts to present to the public, and there are other facts they don't tell you. That's what people also do. So being critical on the data and the facts, I think is also a good idea.
Yeah. There's. I totally agree. If we talk about, healthy skepticism, I think that's very good. I think and for example with COVID, it's hard to think about it differently because it's such a new problem, right? And it'll take a while before a scientific consensus is reached on certain aspects of that data. It's different, of course, for domains like climate science, where now there is this sort of golden standard of evidence has now been reached, where the evidence is overwhelming to such an extent that it's really hard to contest that fact. But of course, it takes years and years for the science to gradually move to that level. And with COVID, of course, it's a very fresh and new problem, and it's unlikely that we'll reach that stage anytime soon. I agree with that. Yeah.
If ever. Yeah.
So
optimistic.
By answering this question from the public, we've already kind of moved into the third part, which is talking about the solutions for this issue. The question is about like how we can regain the trust of those who lost it, more or less. But we're actually already touching upon that a little bit with the discussion that we just had. I'm wondering, would you say that because so we have the criticalness on data versus the criticalness on policy, and then Daniela, you say, well, you can also be very critical on the data. If we were to publicly project that is something that we as the scientific community frequently do you think that would make a difference for these people who are very into the actual conspiracy theories?
To talk about the data?
Mm-hmm.
You mean? No, I don't think that would make a difference if you, and Buster was also referring to that also, when you give people more data and more facts and more arguments why your facts are the truth, they will not believe you, I guess, because it does not fit their framework of thinking, of course. And they probably have arguments why it's not, why you are saying that, but that your data are not that solid, I think.
Right.
Yeah. So having a fight about data will not help, if that's what you're referring to. And when you go, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, well, so what I meant was actually kind of the opposite. If you're flexible with their argument against your data, is that something that would help them be more open to your criticism of their theory? So if you kind of bend with them a little bit, like
you bend with them, like in you I'm not sure what you're referring to, but when you say, well, these are my facts and this is how I see it, but let's discuss how you see it and what are your why do you think this is different? Yeah, and that's if you mean them taking their perspective, why they think this is true and why they have a different opinion, and discuss why they think that way. Yeah, so you can certainly do that, because what you're doing then is to take them seriously and don't put them in a box of crazy people, because that's certainly not the case. Yeah, that would help, taking someone else's perspective. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, Daniela, but just as a side note, I think it's also important to keep in mind that I think when you weigh the ideas of one individual, member of the public, for example, against, of course, not the opinion or the data of one scientist, but of a collective of scientists or the scientific enterprise, if you will, of course, that's not something that you can weigh in equal measure, right? So I think, I fully agree that you need to engage in dialogue, but also sort of be mindful of the fact that it's not just a matter of, there's a difference in opinion, and these differences are weighed in equal measure. That's, I think, important to also keep in mind.
So we're running towards the end of the talk already, so I want to move forward a little bit to the final questions, one of which is, what kind of structural changes can we make to really support the trust in science? So we touched upon it a little bit earlier, I think, with education programs, but could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think it's very interesting to bring up.
To foster trust, yeah. Well, when you take this Corona crisis, on maybe the vaccination too, what you should do is show that you're competent, show that you are competent in handling the pandemic, or also show that in general vaccines have a very solid reputation regarding safety. That's what you should do. That's what you should do. And the second thing is be very explicit that it's public health which is important. It's that's the value is public health and not economy, and that's why it is not that very smart if in the pharmaceutical company says I want to make I want to make some interest, some money out of this vaccine, because then different values are involved. And also to be 100% transparent about everything, about the risks, about the side effects, publish all the side effects, and also about the money, of course, who's earning what.
And in terms of education or understanding, I guess, is there a role there for certain education programs? Because
I think there's a lot to be gained with education on science and what science is. What I mentioned before, philosophy of science, the scientific method, early on in secondary school already. And I think it's really nice to see that there's children's museums like Nemo in Amsterdam, where even very young children are sort of get acquainted with what science is and what scientists do, and get excited also about science. It should also be about making people enthusiastic about science. I think that's also an important aspect. So, but that's very young children, and then maybe I'm an expert on secondary school curriculums, but in my view, I think there could be more attention for that in secondary school age, 12 to 18 years old. So that's one thing. But that being said, education and especially scientific knowledge and just providing people information is not going to solve skepticism, per se. Depends a little bit on the topic. So there you have to think a little bit more about what the hurdles are for people to accept science, like climate change, for example, for people on the political conservative side of the spectrum, and think about, okay, what is the issue here? What's the problem, and can we maybe take away that problem? With climate change, I think it's a very good example that you're seeing worldwide skepticism decreasing because the threat of climate change is getting more and more real. It used to be this psychologically distant problem, something happening in the distant future. You're not really experiencing climate change. It's such a slow process. Or maybe it just happens to countries far away, like Bangladesh, where you have these floodings, etc. But of course, in the last decade or so, we're experiencing this ourselves more and more. The effects of climate change, and then the problem becomes psychologically more close, and you can only but take the problem more seriously. So with these types of issues, I think that some of the skepticism will go away by itself, simply because the problem presents itself more clearly. But the question, of course, is then it might be too late, to still adapt policy to that. Yeah. So I think one additional step would be to bring science more close to the individual, and bring the problem also more close to the individual.
Yeah, and to add to that, your earlier point, education helps compared to other countries. According to the Eurobarometer, Dutch people are rather knowledgeable about vaccination and vaccines. And you can see, compared to other countries, there is much less skepticism about vaccination in the Netherlands compared to like Italy or
France.
And that does make a difference. Good information about the topic. Of course, it doesn't solve everything, but it certainly helps.
Certainly helps.
So good information, good education, basically is the answer to many of these issues, you would say.
Yeah, and added to that, the removing the psychological barriers for acceptance of science. I think that's important too.
Yeah. So we are at the end of the hour, and I think this is a nice note to end that up. We do have time for some more questions. So I think we will have a look what there is in the question box right now.
Oh, I found an interesting one here. What's the danger or downside of just ignoring the conspiracy believers? Just like some kind of weird group in the Netherlands is just sniffing glue in their free time. Okay, we don't have to really care about them, but as Sloot is saying, they don't usually seem to be open to new perspectives. So discussing these matters can also be seen as a waste of time and energy. And like, is there also a level like you the extremely cookie ones you would ignore, but like most of the normal folk would just have doubts you should interact with?
Well, yeah, no, I would say in a pre-internet age, I would fully agree. Just let these people have their beliefs, and that's fine. I mean, in medieval times, you had flat earthers too, even after Galileo. So that's just leave them be. Problem, of course, is with even very fringe types of conspiracy beliefs. Due to social media, it's very easy to see these beliefs spreading, and potentially reaching a larger audience. Again, QAnon, I think, is a good example of that happening. A very fringy type of conspiracy theory that really finds its way to a larger audience via social media. So I think the just ignoring part really no longer is an option in the current internet age.
No, it's not an option because of social media and because of it spreads so fast. The conspiracy theories have always been there, will not disappear. But government or authorities should find a way how to handle the myths or the conspiracy theories on social media. And the solution is not just debunking the myths or whatever, because that will not going to help. So. But on the other hand, one could say that many people in the RVM behavioral study about Corona, one of the questions was also, what do you do with all these conspiracy theories? And many people just say, well, I hear them, but I don't care. So a lot of people don't care also. So I don't think we have to be too pessimistic, but I do agree, if you don't address them or address what's behind the conspiracy theories, then you will have a problem. So it's not a clear answer, but you have to find a way to how to navigate in these conspiracy theories. Yeah, you can't let them go because no.
All right. There's also not a lot of time, so let's have this one question that's quite surprising. I didn't expect this one today. by one Jeroen Goedkoop, a Science article says that more than 50% of PhDs, at least in the United States of America, work in industry, and that some of the university staff still gets paid by industry, let's say some kind of additional funding from an organization. So how much can we trust them? Because as Bastian said, there's a difference between trust from people in academia and business. What happens when those two actually mix?
Can you trust those people who are paid by the industry? Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah, but and now it's in science. When you do your PhD, you have to how do you say that? Say that you're integer, to pledge integrity, and that you will also reveal conflicts of interest. And that's the only solution. In the Netherlands, you have now for PhD students many courses for scientific integrity. And I think that is a good idea, because you can end up in situations where you think, well, I can do this, I can give this, go on this trip paid by the pharmacy. I don't care, but I can be objective, but you are influenced by that, certainly. So to have this education and discourse about scientific integrity and realize what it does to you when you are paid by industry, paid by whatever.
Yeah, and I must say I'm surprised by the 50% number.
Yeah.
That's very high. And of course, yeah, science should be as independent as possible. And I do see the problem there. It's also not easy to come up with a solution to this. I think you just hope that the self-correcting mechanism, you know, that's part of science, should in the end hopefully weed out any, you know, subjective results, you know, that result from such industry funding. But yeah, it seems to me a huge problem if we really talk about these numbers, 50%. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we have time for one more question, which is was just sent in. It's not entirely your field, but it might be nice to get your perspective on it anyways. And that is that social media, such as YouTube and Facebook, are moving into the direction of censoring what they believe to be conspiracy theories or fake news. How do you feel about these practices?
Yeah. Sorry, Daniela.
No,
Start?
No, I think that's a difficult question. If Facebook and Google is of YouTube, of Twitter is taking off certain topics because they think it's conspiracy. Well, how do they know? I don't have an answer to that. It's just you never know what's conspiracy or not. When it comes to discrimination, racism, violence, etc. Yeah, well, that's a different topic. That's not good.
Yeah, it's a thin line, I suppose, right?
Yeah,
so once a social media company has the power to decide what is a conspiracy and what is not, I don't think that's something that anyone would want. To have these companies have such power. But of course, on the other hand, we do have to realize that these companies, you know, use certain algorithms that sort of help these certain conspiracy theories at least to flourish and be reinforced, you know, constantly, you know, on platforms like YouTube or Twitter. And that's also something where these companies might want to take more responsibility. So I guess more legislation and regulation would be in order, but in the end, it shouldn't be up to these companies to decide what is conspiracy theory and what is not. Yeah. You know, it's as Danielle said, it would be good to at least start with drawing a line where, you know, things like, you know, violence or racism or sexism or any of that comes into play. But that would only be a start, of course.
All right. I think we have to leave it at this, but I want to thank both of you very much for being here today. I think it was a very, very nice combination. Thank you as well to all of the visitors for today. I'm really glad that you watched us. We have another edition next month. Please keep an eye out for that on the website of SPY25. It will be about women in science and CRISPR-Cas9 in relation to two women winning the Nobel Prize for Science last month. Yes, and thank you very much to SPY25 as well for hosting this event, and we hope to see you very soon again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for
Thanks.
listening. Thanks. Bye-bye.